The late afternoon sun hung low over the dusty main street of Dry Creek, bleeding gold into the edges of the wooden storefronts and sending long, sharp shadows across the cracked earth. A dry wind whistled through the gaps between buildings, carrying with it the smell of horses, hay, and the faint tang of whiskey from the saloon. Saturday was always the busiest day, and town ranchers, farmers, and drifters alike came in to trade, gossip, and gather supplies before heading back out into the lonely expanse of prairie that stretched for miles in every direction. At the center of the street stood a makeshift wooden platform, more of a wagon bed propped up on barrels than a proper stage where the weekly livestock auction was held. Normally, the goods were simple: a few head of cattle, some weathered farm tools, maybe an old mule that had more years behind it than ahead. The auctioneer, a wiry man with a thick mustache and a voice that could cut through a thunderstorm, stood there now, leaning on his cane and barking out the details of the latest lot, a sturdy young steer that fetched a decent price from a cattleman in a dusty brown hat. The crowd shuffled, boots grinding into the dry dirt, spurs jingling as deals were struck and coins clinked. Somewhere nearby, a harmonica played a slow, lonesome tune, mingling with the creak of leather saddles and the occasional snort from the penned livestock. But then the mood shifted. A man came stumbling out from behind the saloon, leading not an animal but a girl. His gait was uneven, swaying like a ship in rough water, and even from a distance it was clear he'd been deep in the bottle. His shirt was stained, half-buttoned, and his eyes were bleary, bloodshot. A nearly empty whiskey bottle dangled from one hand, and the other gripped the thin wrist of the girl so tightly that her skin looked pale beneath his fingers. She was young, 16, maybe 17 at most. Her dress was plain but clean, though the hem was frayed, and her dark hair fell in loose, tangled strands around her face. Her eyes, though, were what drew the most attention, not because they were bright, but because they seemed distant, unfocused, as though she wasn't really seeing the crowd at all. She didn't speak, didn't resist, just let herself be pulled along, her head bowed slightly, her hands clasped together in front of her. The murmurs started immediately. "What's he doing? That's Tom Grady's girl, ain't it? Lord above, is he? No, he wouldn't." But he would. The drunk staggered up onto the auction platform, dragging the girl behind him. The auctioneer, caught off guard, blinked in confusion. "Tom, what in blazes are you doing?" "This here's a livestock sale. She's mine," the man slurred, waving his bottle toward the crowd like a preacher making a point. "Ain't worth keepin' no more. Can't hear, can't talk. More trouble than a sick cow. I'm sellin' her cheap." The words hit the crowd like a bad smell. A few gasped outright. Others muttered curses under their breath. But no one stepped forward. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with disgust and a strange kind of shame for standing there, for watching, for not moving. The girl remained still, her eyes fixed somewhere far away, as though she had learned a long time ago not to fight, not to speak, not to give anyone a reason to notice her more than they already did. The auctioneer tried to intervene. "Tom, this ain't it." "Is," Tom snapped, his voice ugly now, loud enough to carry. "Ain't a law says I can't sell what's mine. You folks trade mules, I'm trading her. Start the bidding at $2. Silence. Nobody wanted to touch this. It wasn't right. Everyone knew it. But in a town like Dry Creek, right and wrong sometimes got lost in the dust between what a man could do and what anyone was willing to stop. And then, from the back of the crowd, a voice spoke. Low, steady. "I'll take her." Heads turned. There he was, Elias Carter, the lonely rancher. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind, Elias stood with his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn duster coat. He was a man people didn't know much about, though everyone knew his name. He ran A modest ranch out west of town, kept to himself, didn't drink, didn't talk much, and never came to town except for supplies. Rumor said he'd lost his wife years back and never looked for another. Rumor also said he preferred cattle to company. He stepped forward now, his boots crunching in the dirt, and repeated, "I'll take her." The drunk blinked, swaying slightly. "You got $2?" Elias reached into his coat, pulled out 2 silver coins, and tossed them up onto the platform. They landed with a hard metallic clink. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but still no one stopped it. Tom grinned a crooked, whiskey-soaked grin, shoved the girl toward Elias, and pocketed the coins. "She's yours now." The girl stumbled forward, catching herself at the last moment, and looked up just for a second into Elias's eyes. There was no recognition there, no gratitude, no fear. Just emptiness. Elias didn't say anything. He just put his steadying hand on her shoulder, turned, and led her away from the crowd. Behind them, the auction went on as if nothing unusual had happened. But every person there knew they'd remember the sight, the lonely rancher walking away with the girl the drunk had sold for $2, the sun casting their shadows long and thin across the dust, and none of them had any idea that this was the start of something that would change both their lives forever. The wagon wheels creaked in slow rhythm as Elias guided his team along the dusty trail west, away from Dry Creek. The sky above stretched wide and cloudless, painted in the pale blue of a summer afternoon. The girl sat beside him on the worn bench seat, her hands folded in her lap, her posture rigid, eyes fixed on the road ahead but not truly seeing it. Elias didn't push her to speak or sign, though he wasn't sure how much she could understand him at all. The silence wasn't uncomfortable for him. Elias had long grown used to quiet, his ranch miles from the nearest neighbor, the only regular sounds being the wind across the grass and the occasional lowing of cattle. But there was something different about this silence, something heavy, like a stone sitting between them. From time to time, Elias glanced sideways. The girl's hair was dark and thick, though tangled at the ends, and her dress, while fade, had been mended more than once with uneven stitches. She didn't fidget. She didn't glance around. She didn't seem curious about where they were going. He wondered if she'd simply learn not to ask questions because answers were never good. The trail wound through rolling grassland, dotted with clusters of mesquite and sagebrush. A lone hawk circled overhead, riding the warm currents. Elias let the reins rest loosely in his hands. The horses knowing the way as well as he did, they reached the ranch by late afternoon. The place wasn't large, just a modest clapboard house, with a pitched roof, a barn with faded red paint, and a corral with rails that had seen better days. Beyond that stretched acres of open range, the grass swaying gently in the breeze. Elias climbed down first, tied off the horses, and extended a hand to help her down. She hesitated but took it, her fingers small and cool against his. Once her boots touched the ground, she stepped back, eyes scanning the house as though measuring the distance to every door and window. "This way," Elias said, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. He gestured with his hand, and she followed. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. The main room was simple wood plank floors, a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with a few worn books. There was no clutter, no ornaments, just the necessities of a man who lived alone. Elias led her down a short hallway to a small bedroom. The bed was neatly made, covered in a faded quilt. A wooden dresser stood in the corner, empty drawers waiting. A single window looked out toward the barn. "You can stay here," he said, speaking slow and clear. He pointed at the bed, then mimed sleeping, hoping she understood. Her gaze flicked from his face to the bed, and after a pause, she nodded once. He left her to settle in, retreating to the kitchen to start supper. He kept his movements quiet, not wanting to startle her, but from the corner of his eye he noticed her reappear in the doorway after a few minutes. She lingered there, watching him cut bread and ladle stew into bowls. "Hungry?" he asked, holding up the ladle. She didn't respond, but she stepped forward when he gestured to the table. He set a bowl in front of her and took the opposite seat. She ate slowly, carefully, as though making sure not to spill a drop. He didn't press her with questions, didn't ask about her father or her past or why she'd been sold. He figured she'd tell him in her own time, if she ever wanted to. Over the next few days, Elias noticed things. Little things. 1. Morning, as he worked in the corral, he saw her step out onto the porch, her head turning toward the barn at the sound of a hammer striking wood. Another time, when a horse whinnied sharply, she flinched just slightly, but enough for him to notice. And late one night, when the wind picked up and rattled the shutters, he thought he heard her humming softly in her room. If she was truly deaf, she shouldn't have reacted to any of it. Still, he didn't confront her. Instead, he went about his work, mending fences, tending cattle, and fixing a stubborn hinge on the barn door. She stayed close to the house at first, sweeping the porch or quietly peeling vegetables at the table. She moved with a kind of careful precision, always watching her hands, always aware of where she placed her feet. On the fourth evening, Elias came in from the barn to find her standing by the window, the last of the day's sunlight catching in her hair. She was staring toward the horizon, where the land seemed to stretch forever. "Not much out there," he said softly, almost to himself. Her head turned, just slightly, almost like she'd heard him. Elias's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in thought. He was beginning to think the story he'd been told about her being deaf and mute wasn't the truth at all. And if that wasn't true, then there was a much bigger question. Why had she let everyone believe it? The answer, he suspected, wasn't going to be simple. The day had been long. Elias had spent most of it repairing a broken section of fence at the north pasture, the August heat settling heavy over the land like a thick blanket. By the time the sun slid low behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of rust and gold, his shirt clung damp to his back, and his arms ached from swinging the hammer. The girl, he still didn't know her name, had stayed close to the house all day. He'd noticed her watching him from the porch earlier, a quiet silhouette framed against the doorway, but she disappeared inside when he caught her eye. Elias didn't take it personally. She had her own world, one he wasn't invited into yet. By the time he walked the horses back to the barn, the air was cooling. Crickets were starting their evening chorus, and the smell of cut hay lingered faint in the breeze. He led the horses into their stalls, rubbing them down with slow, steady strokes, letting the rhythm of the work ease the tightness in his muscles. It was then, faint but clear, that he heard it singing soft and low, like a lullaby meant for no one but the singer herself. Elias froze mid-motion, his hand resting on the warm flank of the bay gelding. The voice was gentle, almost hesitant, as though it had been unused for a long time. The words were indistinct, but the tune haunting. In its sweetness carried through the quiet barn, like a thread of light in the dark. He turned his head toward the far end of the barn. The door to the old tack room stood slightly ajar, a thin strip of lamplight spilling across the dusty floorboards. The singing came from there. Elias moved quietly, his boots silent on the packed dirt, until he reached the doorway. Through the gap, he saw her. She sat on a small stool, a tin basin of water at her feet, washing what looked like a set of saddle blankets. Her head was bent slightly, hair falling forward, and her lips moved in time with the melody. The lamplight caught her face and profile, softening the guarded expression he'd grown used to. She looked different like this, almost peaceful, and she was hearing herself sing. He stepped forward, and the floor creaked beneath his boot. The sound stopped instantly. She froze, her hands still in the water, her shoulders going stiff. Slowly she turned her head, her eyes wide and caught between fear and shame. Elias didn't speak at first. He just stepped inside, the door swinging open behind him. "You can hear." His voice was quiet but certain. Her eyes dropped to the basin. "You've been hearing this whole time." No answer. "You can talk too." Still no answer, but her throat worked as if she were swallowing something heavy. "Why?" Elias asked, his tone free of anger but full of the weight of his confusion. "Why pretend?" For a long moment, it seemed she might not answer at all. Then, in a voice rough from disuse, she spoke. "Because hearing didn't help me before." Elias stayed silent, waiting. She set the blanket aside and wiped her wet hands on her skirt, her gaze still fixed on the floor. "When I was little, I tried to talk, tried to tell people what my father did. No one listened. They told me I was making it up. After a while, I stopped talking. My father said if I pretended to be deaf, people wouldn't bother me, wouldn't expect anything from me. He said it was easier that way." Her voice trembled not with tears, but with something harder, something born of years of keeping her own words locked inside. Elias felt a slow, simmering heat rise in his chest, not at her, but at the man who'd raised her. He kept his own voice steady. "Easier for him, maybe, not for you." She gave a small, bitter shrug. "Hearing meant I had to hear every time he cursed at me, every time he told folks I was worthless, every fight, every bottle hitting the table. Silence was better, so I made it." Elias leaned against the doorframe, studying her. "You've got a good voice. It's a shame to keep it locked away." Her lips pressed together, and for a moment he thought she might cry. But she didn't. She straightened her shoulders instead, meeting his gaze for the first time since he'd walked in. "I sing when no one can hear. That's enough." "Not anymore?" Elias said quietly. Something in his tone made her pause, not a command, not even a request, just a statement that felt solid, like a post driven deep into the ground. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the lamplight flickering between them. Then, without another word, Elias stepped back into the main barn, giving her the space to decide what she wanted to do next. Out behind him, the singing didn't return. But he knew now, and he wasn't about to let her live in silence forever. The week after Elias heard her sing passed in a strange kind of calm. Not peaceful, no. Peace was something else entirely, but calm. Like the quiet before a storm when the air feels thick, the sky just a shade too still. Elias didn't press her about what she'd told him. He didn't ask for more details about her father, didn't demand she start talking or singing in front of him. But he did start speaking to her more simple things in a slow, steady tone, just to let her know he wasn't afraid of her voice. Sometimes she answered in words so soft they barely reached his ears. Other times she stayed silent, though he knew she'd heard every syllable. It was on a Thursday afternoon, the kind where the sunlight seemed to spill gold over everything, that the trouble came riding in. Elias was in the barn, pitching fresh hay into the stalls, when the sound of hooves thundered down the dirt road leading to the house. Not one rider, three. The horses were pushed hard, their tack jangling as they closed the distance. Elias's grip tightened on the pitchfork, the muscles in his shoulders tensing. Out here, 3 riders showing up unannounced rarely meant good news. He stepped out into the barnyard just as the riders pulled up in a cloud of dust. The lead horse was a rangy bay, and on its back sat Tom Grady. Even from a distance, Elias could see the red flush of whiskey in his cheeks, the mean set of his mouth. The other 2 men were rough-looking, both carrying themselves with the kind of casual arrogance that came from too many nights in saloons and not enough mornings doing honest work. Tom swung down from his horse, swaggering forward like he owned the place. "Elias Carter," he called, voice slurred but sharp enough to cut. "We got business." Elias didn't move from where he stood. "Can't imagine we do." Tom grinned, but there was nothing friendly in it. "You bought something from me in town a couple weeks back." He glanced toward the house, where the girl's shadow had appeared in the front window. "Turns out you didn't get what you paid for." Elias's jaw tightened. "I paid exactly what you asked." "Transactions." "Done." "Not hardly." Tom shot back, taking another step closer. "You bought her 'cause she was deaf and dumb. That was the deal. She's not deaf, hell, she's not dumb either. You got yourself a talking girl worth more than what you paid." Elias didn't glance toward the house again, but he could feel her watching. "She's not a mule you can come back and barter over." Tom's grin twisted into a sneer. "She's mine. My blood. You think handing me $2 means you get to keep her forever? I came to take her back." Elias's voice went flat. "You're not tacking her anywhere." The two men behind Tom shifted in their saddles, one resting a hand near the butt of his revolver. Tom's eyes glinted. "You gonna stop me, Carter? You against me and my boys?" Before Elias could answer, the front door banged open. She stepped out onto the porch, her face pale but her back straight. For a moment, she stood frozen, looking from Elias to her father. Then something in her gaze hardened. "Go back," she said, her voice steady, carrying across the yard. Tom's head snapped toward her, eyes going wide. "Well, I'll be damned. You can talk." She took a step forward, her fists clenched at her sides. "I can hear too. I always could. I just didn't want to hear you anymore." The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Tom's shock turned quickly to rage, his face mottling red. "You ungrateful little." He started forward, but Elias stepped between them, his tall frame a solid wall of protection. "That's far." "Enough," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. Tom stopped, glaring up at him. "She's my daughter. I'll take her if I want." "Not from here you won't." For a tense moment, no one moved. The air between them felt tight enough to snap. One of Tom's men shifted again, his fingers brushing his pistol. Elias's hand rested near his own holster, his stance unyielding. And then HOOFBEATS. From the road behind them, a lone rider appeared, the sheriff's star glinting in the sunlight. Sheriff Mason wasn't a man for small talk. His eyes took in the scene, narrowed, and his voice carried like the crack of a whip. "Tom Grady, you and your boys best turn those horses around." "Now?" Tom swore under his breath, but with the sheriff there, the fight drained from him. He spat into the dirt, swung back into the saddle, and pointed a shaking finger at Elias. "This ain't over." The three of them wheeled their horses and galloped off, dust rising behind them until they were just a smear on the horizon. Elias turned to her. She was trembling now, the adrenaline wearing off, but her chin was still high. "You did good," he said quietly. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was something in them besides guarded distance, something fierce, alive and unafraid. The sheriff's visit bought Elias and the girl Clara, as he now knew her name, 3 days of uneasy quiet. 3 days where she worked alongside him in the barn, speaking more freely than ever before. 3 days where Elias kept glancing toward the road, his gut telling him Tom Grady wasn't the sort of man to let pride wounds heal on their own. On the 4th day, trouble came back. It started with the low, distant rumble of hooves too many for just one rider. Elias was by the corral, mending a loose rail, when the sound rolled in from the north. The sky was pale and cloudless, offering no cover, no distraction, just open daylight for whatever was coming. Elias straightened slowly, sliding his hammer into the belt at his waist. From the barn door, Clara's eyes found his, and without a word, he shook his head. Stay inside. The riders crested the ridge in a cluster of dust and sunlight. 4 of them this time, Tom Grady in the lead, a rifle slung carelessly across his saddle. His 2 drinking partners flanked him, and a 4th man, bigger than the rest, rode behind, his hat pulled low. They came fast, pulling up in the yard with horses blowing hard from the run. Tom swung down, boots hitting dirt like he was stomping. The land into submission. "Afternoon, Carter," Tom drawled, though his voice held no trace of friendliness. "Reckon I'm here for what's mine." "You rode all this way to waste your breath," Elias replied, his tone flat as a fence post. Tom's grin was like a cut thin and dangerous. "Not this time." He turned his head slightly. "Boys." The 2 riders dismounted, spreading out just enough to box Elias in. The big man stayed in his saddle, scanning the horizon, probably a lookout in case the sheriff came nosing around again. Inside the house, Clara moved to the window, heart pounding. She could see the way Elias stood weight-balanced, ready but not provoking. She could also see the glint of metal at Tom's hip. "I ain't gonna say it again," Tom said, stepping closer. "You hand her over now, we ride away easy." "You don't?" He let the sentence hang, his hand brushing the butt of his pistol. Elias's eyes narrowed. "You try to take her, you won't leave on your feet." Tom's face tightened, and for a moment no one moved. Then he lunged forward, shoving Elias hard in the chest. Elias didn't stumble. He caught Tom's wrist and twisted, forcing a grunt of pain. One of the other men surged forward, swinging a fist that caught Elias on the jaw. The fight exploded. Elias drove an elbow into the man's ribs, spinning him off balance, then turned just in time to block Tom's wild punch. They grappled in the dirt, boots digging furrows, grunts and curses filling the air. From the porch, Clara stepped out, fear twisting her stomach. She could run, but the image of Elias fighting alone burned hot in her mind. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from just inside the doorway and moved down the steps. Silent as a shadow, one of Tom's men spotted her and turned, but too late. Clara swung the skillet with all her strength. The crack of iron on skull sent the man sprawling, his hat tumbling into the dust. Elias caught sight of her and shouted, "Get back!" But the warning was cut short as Tom slammed a fist into his side. Pain shot through him, but he held his ground, shoving Tom backward. The big lookout dismounted now, drawing a knife. Clara froze, heart hammering. As he came toward her. Elias saw the blade glint in the sunlight, and something primal surged in him. He shoved Tom hard enough to send him staggering, then reached for the hammer still at his belt. The first swing caught the big man's knife hand, making the blade clatter to the ground. The second swing, shorter, heavier, drove the man back toward the corral fence. The sound of more hooves split the air, this time from the south. Sheriff Mason and 2 deputies thundered into the yard, rifles raised. Tom froze, chest heaving, eyes darting between Elias, Clara, and the sheriff. "That's enough." Mason's voice cracked like a whip. "Drop your weapons, all of you." Reluctantly, Tom let his pistol fall into the dirt. The other men followed, except the one Clara had knocked out. He lay still, moaning faintly. "You've crossed the line, Grady," the sheriff said, swinging down from his horse. "Assault, trespass, attempted kidnapping. You and your boys are done." Ropes came out fast. Within minutes, Tom and his men were bound and hauled toward town, their curses fading with distance. When the dust settled, Elias turned to Clara. She still held the skillet, knuckles white, chest rising and falling. In short bursts, "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, but her voice shook when she answered. "I wasn't going to let them take me." Elias's gaze softened. "They won't, not while I'm here." And for the first time since she'd stepped foot on his ranch, Clara believed him completely. The yard was quiet now. Too quiet after the chaos of shouting men, thudding boots, and the metallic clash of fists and steel. The sheriff's dust cloud had long since faded down the road toward town, taking Tom Grady and his men with it. What lingered was the smell of sweat, churned earth, and the faint tang of iron from the skillet still in Clara's hands. She stood there on the porch steps, breathing hard, her hair loose around her face, the afternoon sun catching in the strands. Elias stood a few feet away, wiping a streak of blood from his jaw with the back of his hand. "Here," he said quietly, taking the skillet from her fingers. "You about dented this thing." "I thought I dented him," she said, a shaky laugh breaking through. That made Elias smile, just a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth. But it softened him, chased away the hard lines of the fight. "You might have done that too." They moved inside, where the air was cooler. Elias sat at the table, and Clara fetched the tin of salve and a clean rag. She worked without saying much, her hand surprisingly steady as she dabbed at the split on his cheek and the bruise blooming along his jaw. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Only when you poke it like that," he said. Deadpan dot, she almost rolled. Her eyes but caught herself because even teasing felt new, unfamiliar. And it felt good. For a while, neither spoke. The only sounds were the soft scrape of chair legs and the wind outside brushing against the house. Finally, Clara set the salve down. "They're not coming back, are they?" Elias met her gaze. "No. Not after today. Sheriff will see to that." She nodded, but the question had been more than about her father. It was about safety, about belonging, about whether this place was really hers now or just another stop before someone decided to take her away again. Elias seemed to read that in her face. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Clara, you're not going anywhere." "Not unless you decide to." Her throat tightened. "You mean I can stay?" "I reckon the ranch could use another pair of hands," he said, his tone deliberately casual. "And I reckon I like having someone around who sings to the chickens." She laughed then, an honest laugh, light and unguarded, and he knew his. Words had landed where they needed to. The days that followed felt different. The ranch, once filled with long silences and the creak of windmill blades, now carried the sound of Clara's voice, sometimes talking to Elias as they worked, sometimes humming old songs as she moved through the kitchen. Elias taught her to ride proper, not just sit on a horse's back but guide it, feel it move beneath her. She learned to mend fences, gather eggs without getting pecked, and even rope a calf, though she missed her first throw and sent Elias into a fit of quiet laughter. One evening, they sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the far hills. The sky was a deep burnished gold, streaked with violet, and the air smelled of warm dust and hay. "I used to think quiet was all I wanted," Elias said. "And now?" Clara asked. "Now I think I just wanted someone who understands it. And knows when to break it." She smiled at that. "I can be noisy if you want." "I know," he said, and there was a warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before. A week later, a package arrived from town. Inside was a small second-hand guitar, its wood worn smooth. Elias had traded a couple of steers for it without telling her. "I heard you singing that night in the barn," he said as he handed it to her. "Figured you ought to have something to sing with." Her fingers trembled over the strings, and when she strummed the first chords, the sound rolled out across the yard like sunlight spilling over the land. From that day on, the ranch wasn't just his anymore. It was theirs. And in the evenings, as the music drifted through the open windows and the last light of the day faded into the long western night, neither of them felt alone, because they weren't.